The most concerning aspect of Rebecca's operation was the disappearance of several prominent guests who had been expected to continue their journeys but never reached their destinations. Unlike the crude methods employed by the Henley family or even Victoria's more sophisticated approach, Rebecca seemed to have perfected techniques for making people vanish without leaving any trace of suspicious activity. Her guest registry showed completed stays and normal departures, while her staff provided consistent testimony about seeing the missing individuals leave the inn safely. Investigation into these disappearances was hampered by Rebecca's political connections and her reputation as a reformed innkeeper who had successfully overcome the establishment's troubled history. Territorial officials who had publicly praised her efforts were reluctant to admit that their endorsements might have been premature, while the business community that depended on the inn's success resisted suggestions that criminal activity had resumed. The breakthrough in understanding Rebecca's methods came from an unexpected source. Thomas Brennan, a former Army intelligence officer who had been hired as the inn's security chief, began to notice inconsistencies in the stories told by different staff members about specific guests and events. His military training had taught him to recognize when people were following rehearsed scripts rather than recounting genuine memories, and he became convinced that Rebecca was coaching her employees to provide false testimony about guest activities. Thomas's investigation revealed that Rebecca had created an elaborate system of documentation and witness testimony designed to provide cover for her criminal activities. Multiple staff members would be instructed to remember specific details about particular guests, creating consistent but false accounts of their stays and departures. These false memories were supported by forged entries in the guest registry and manufactured evidence of normal business transactions. More disturbing was Thomas's discovery that Rebecca was systematically gathering intelligence about her guests' business activities, family relationships, and financial situations. She had developed techniques for extracting confidential information during casual conversations, then using this knowledge to identify the most profitable targets for various criminal schemes. Her selection criteria had evolved to focus on individuals whose disappearances would be difficult to investigate or whose deaths would benefit specific business or political interests. The investigation also revealed that Rebecca was not operating independently. She was part of a sophisticated criminal network that included corrupt territorial officials, dishonest business leaders, and professional criminals who provided various services ranging from document forgery to body disposal. This network had been operating throughout the frontier territories for years, using hospitality establishments like the Widows Inn as bases for systematic exploitation of wealthy travelers. Rebecca Morrison's downfall began in March 1876, when she made the mistake of targeting a guest who had powerful connections and resources for investigation. Colonel James Whitfield, a retired military officer and successful businessman, had been expected to arrive in Denver for important railroad negotiations. When he failed to appear, his associates hired private investigators who were not influenced by territorial politics or business relationships. The private investigation led by Detective Marcus Kane was more thorough and persistent than previous inquiries into disappearances at the Widows Inn. Kane's team included forensic specialists, handwriting experts, and investigators with experience in complex fraud cases. Their analysis of Rebecca's documentation revealed systematic falsification and manipulation that provided evidence of criminal activity rather than the transparent operations Rebecca claimed to maintain. The investigation culminated in a coordinated raid on the Widows Inn in June 1876, conducted by federal marshals who had jurisdiction independent of territorial authorities. The evidence seized during the raid included detailed records of criminal activities, correspondence with accomplices throughout the region, and physical evidence linking Rebecca to multiple disappearances and murders. The scope of the criminal network that was exposed shocked even experienced federal law enforcement officials. Rebecca Morrison's trial in federal court was the first time that the full extent of the crimes committed at the Widows Inn had been systematically documented and presented to the public. The testimony revealed not just Rebecca's individual crimes, but the existence of a larger conspiracy that had been exploiting the isolation and limited law enforcement resources of frontier territories to commit crimes on an unprecedented scale. The trial also exposed the corruption that had allowed these criminal enterprises to operate with impunity for so long. Several territorial officials were implicated in cover-ups and obstruction of investigations, while business leaders were revealed to have benefited from the elimination of competitors and rivals through the inn's criminal activities. The scandal that emerged from Rebecca's trial led to a complete reorganization of territorial government and law enforcement. Rebecca Morrison was executed in September 1876, but her death did not end the story of the Widows Inn. The federal investigation had revealed that the criminal network she had been part of was still operating, and that other similar establishments throughout the frontier territories were likely serving as bases for related criminal activities. The inn itself had become too notorious to operate as a legitimate business, but its strategic location and existing infrastructure made it valuable for other purposes. The federal investigation triggered by Rebecca Morrison's crimes expanded rapidly as investigators discovered evidence of similar operations throughout the frontier territories. What had initially appeared to be isolated incidents of criminal activity at the Widow's Inn was revealed to be part of a sophisticated network of criminals who had been systematically exploiting the hospitality industry to prey on wealthy travelers for over a decade. Detective Marcus Kane's team identified at least 12 other establishments that appeared to be operating under similar methods, using various combinations of murder, theft, fraud, and identity theft to generate profits while avoiding detection by local authorities. The network's success had depended on careful selection of locations that were isolated enough to prevent witnesses while remaining accessible enough to attract valuable targets. The criminal organization had developed standardized procedures and training programs that allowed them to establish new operations quickly and efficiently. Recruits were taught specific techniques for victim selection, drugging methods, body disposal, and evidence destruction that had been refined through years of experience. The consistency of these methods explained why investigators had noticed similar patterns at different locations throughout the territories. More sophisticated was the network's approach to avoiding detection and prosecution. They had invested heavily in corrupting local officials, creating networks of accomplices in law enforcement, territorial government, and the business community who would either actively assist their operations or simply ignore evidence of criminal activity. This corruption had been so extensive that federal intervention had been necessary to break the cycle of protection and cover-ups. The investigation revealed that the network had been operating as a business, with formal organizational structures, profit-sharing arrangements, and systematic approaches to expansion and development. The criminal leaders had studied legitimate business practices and adapted them for criminal purposes, creating an enterprise that was more sophisticated and profitable than many legal businesses of the time. The Widow's Inn had been one of the most successful operations in this network, generating substantial profits through its strategic location and the high-quality clientele it attracted. The inn's troubled history had actually been advantageous for the criminals, as the succession of different operators had made it difficult for investigators to identify consistent patterns or connect crimes committed years apart. The network's approach to succession planning had been particularly sophisticated. When an operation became too dangerous to continue, whether due to investigative pressure or the mental breakdown of the operators, the criminals would arrange for the establishment to be transferred to new management that appeared to be legitimate. This created the appearance of reform and rehabilitation while actually maintaining criminal control under different identities. The investigation also revealed how the network had financed its operations and laundered its profits. Stolen goods were moved through established criminal networks that had connections to legitimate businesses throughout the country. Gold and jewelry were melted down and sold as raw materials, while important documents were used for identity theft and fraud schemes. The profits were invested in legitimate businesses and real estate, creating the appearance of respectable wealth while funding continued criminal activities. The federal prosecutors who handled the cases arising from the investigation faced unprecedented challenges in dealing with crimes that had been committed across multiple territories and jurisdictions. The evidence was complex and often circumstantial, requiring innovative legal theories and prosecution strategies. The trials that followed established important precedents for federal jurisdiction over interstate criminal enterprises and conspiracy cases. The publicity surrounding the investigation and trials created national attention for the crimes that had been committed at establishments like the Widow's Inn. Newspaper coverage of the trials included detailed descriptions of the criminals' methods and the scope of their operations, educating the public about dangers that had previously been unknown or ignored. This publicity led to increased vigilance among travelers and improved security measures at legitimate hospitality establishments. However, the investigation also revealed troubling questions about how many similar operations might still be functioning undetected throughout the frontier territories. The network that had been exposed was extensive and sophisticated, but investigators acknowledged that it was likely only one of several criminal organizations that were exploiting the lawlessness and isolation of frontier conditions. The impact on the hospitality industry was severe, as travelers became suspicious of establishments that seemed too luxurious or offered rates that seemed too attractive. Legitimate innkeepers found themselves subject to increased scrutiny and regulation as authorities attempted to prevent similar criminal operations from developing. The industry's reputation would take years to recover from the revelations about how extensively it had been infiltrated by criminals. After Rebecca Morrison's execution and the extensive federal investigation, the Widow's Inn remained abandoned for over 2 years. The building had been thoroughly searched and documented as evidence in multiple criminal trials, leaving it damaged and contaminated with the residue of extensive forensic examination. Federal authorities had considered demolishing the structure entirely, but legal complications involving property rights and evidence preservation prevented immediate action. The economic depression that followed the exposure of the criminal network had devastated the Devil's Canyon community. Most legitimate businesses had closed or relocated, leaving only a few struggling enterprises serving the reduced traffic on what had become a secondary route through the mountains. The Stagecoach Company that had previously maintained regular service through the canyon reduced its schedule to weekly runs, reflecting the dramatic decline in travel demand. In September 1878, territorial authorities were approached by Catherine Walsh, a widow from San Francisco who expressed interest in purchasing the Widow's Inn and restoring it to legitimate operation. Catherine's background was extensively investigated by federal authorities who were determined to prevent any resumption of criminal activity at the notorious establishment. Catherine's credentials were impressive and seemed genuine. She was the widow of a successful merchant who had died in a shipping accident, leaving her with substantial financial resources and experience in business management. Her references from San Francisco described her as a competent businesswoman who had managed several successful commercial enterprises, including restaurants and small hotels that had earned reputations for quality service and honest dealing. Unlike her predecessors, Catherine was subjected to intensive background investigation by federal authorities before being approved to purchase the inn. Her financial records were thoroughly examined, her references were verified through multiple sources, and her personal history was investigated in detail. Federal agents interviewed her associates in San Francisco, examined her business records, and even consulted with local law enforcement about her reputation and activities. The investigation revealed no evidence of criminal activity or suspicious associations in Catherine's background. She appeared to be exactly what she claimed, a legitimate businesswoman seeking to establish a respectable hospitality business in a location that offered both challenges and opportunities. Her willingness to submit to extensive investigation and her cooperation with federal authorities suggested genuine commitment to legal operations. Catherine's purchase of the Widow's Inn was conditional on her agreement to extensive oversight and regulation by federal authorities. She accepted requirements for regular inspections, detailed record-keeping, and immediate reporting of any suspicious activities or unusual incidents. These conditions were unprecedented for hospitality businesses, but Catherine accepted them as necessary given the inn's history and the need to rebuild public confidence. The renovation of the inn under Catherine's direction was modest and practical, focusing on functionality and cleanliness rather than luxury or elegance. She removed the elaborate decorations and sophisticated systems that had characterized previous operations, creating a simple, straightforward establishment that prioritized basic comfort and honest service over impressive appearances. Catherine's staffing approach reflected her commitment to legitimate operations. She hired local workers rather than importing experienced staff from distant locations, choosing individuals whose backgrounds and reputations were well known to the community. Her staff included Jonas Pittman's nephew as a maintenance worker, Dr. Whitmore's assistant as a part-time clerk, and several local women as housekeepers and kitchen help. The reopening of the Widow's Inn in March 1879 was deliberately understated, without the elaborate celebrations that had marked previous reopenings. Catherine advertised the inn as a simple, honest establishment that provided basic hospitality services at fair prices. Her marketing emphasized safety, cleanliness, and reliability rather than luxury or sophistication. The initial response to Catherine's operation was cautious but gradually became more positive as travelers discovered that the inn was indeed providing the straightforward, honest service she had promised. Her rates were reasonable, her meals were simple but well prepared, and her staff was courteous and helpful without being intrusive. The establishment began to attract steady, if modest, business from travelers who appreciated reliable service. For nearly 18 months, Catherine's operation of the Widow's Inn appeared to be a complete success. Federal inspections found no evidence of illegal activity, her record-keeping was meticulous and transparent, and her interactions with guests were consistently professional and appropriate. The inn's reputation began to recover as word spread that it was finally under genuinely legitimate management. However, in September 1880, the pattern that had characterized the inn's history began to repeat itself. Catherine Walsh was found dead in her private quarters by a guest who had come to inquire about extending his stay. The circumstances of her death were immediately suspicious, as she appeared to have been in good health and had shown no signs of illness or distress. Dr. Whitmore's examination of Catherine's body revealed evidence of poisoning using compounds that were consistent with the methods employed by previous operators of the inn. The poison appeared to have been administered in food or drink, and the symptoms suggested a substance that would have caused rapid incapacitation followed by death within a few hours. The timing and method of Catherine's murder indicated that her killer had intimate knowledge of the techniques used by the inn's previous criminal operators. The federal investigation into Catherine's death revealed disturbing evidence that the criminal network supposedly dismantled by previous prosecutions had been secretly reconstituting itself. Catherine had apparently been targeted for elimination because her legitimate operation of the inn was interfering with plans to resume criminal activities at the location. Her death was intended to clear the way for another criminal operator to take control of the establishment. The investigation also revealed that Catherine had been receiving threatening communications in the weeks before her death, warnings that she should abandon her operation of the inn and leave the territory. These threats had apparently been dismissed as pranks or attempts at extortion, but they were revealed to be serious warnings from criminals who were determined to resume their profitable activities at the strategic location. More troubling was the discovery that some of the federal officials who had supposedly been investigating and prosecuting the criminal network had actually been providing information to the criminals, allowing them to avoid capture and continue their operations. This corruption had enabled the network to survive the previous investigations and position itself for a resumption of activities once official attention had moved to other matters. Catherine Walsh's funeral was attended by federal investigators who observed the ceremony carefully, looking for suspicious individuals who might be connected to her murder. The investigation had expanded beyond the immediate crime to focus on identifying and prosecuting the surviving members of the criminal network who had apparently been planning a return to their previous activities. The evidence gathered during the investigation into Catherine's murder led to a series of arrests and prosecutions that finally succeeded in dismantling the remnants of the criminal network. Several corrupt federal officials were prosecuted for their roles in protecting the criminals, while surviving network members were identified and arrested through improved investigative techniques and interstate cooperation. Following Catherine Walsh's murder and the final dismantling of the criminal network, federal authorities made the decision to maintain direct control over the widows and rather than risk another civilian operator. The building was converted into a federal way station, staffed by government employees who provided basic services to official travelers while maintaining security to prevent any resumption of criminal activity. This arrangement continued for 3 years, during which time the inn served as a symbol of federal authority and determination to prevent further criminal exploitation of frontier hospitality establishments. However, the cost of maintaining federal operation was substantial, and political pressure to return the property to private hands gradually increased as memories of the criminal activities faded. In June 1883, federal authorities announced their intention to sell the widows into qualified private operators, subject to extensive screening and ongoing oversight. The announcement generated limited interest, as most potential buyers were deterred by the property's notorious history and the extensive regulatory requirements that would govern its operation. The only serious applicant was Eleanor Blackwood, a widow from Boston who had been operating charitable institutions for traveling women and families throughout the frontier territories. Eleanor's background was exemplary. She was a well-educated woman from a prominent family who had dedicated herself to philanthropic work following her husband's death in the Civil War. Her references included letters from territorial governors, prominent businessmen, and religious leaders who vouched for her character and competence. Eleanor's proposal for the widows' inn was unique among hospitality establishments of the era. She intended to operate it as a charitable institution that would provide safe, affordable accommodations for women and families traveling alone, a demographic that had been particularly vulnerable to exploitation and violence on frontier routes. Her plan included special security measures, resident staff trained in medical care, and connections to charitable organizations that could provide assistance to travelers in distress. The federal investigation of Eleanor's background was even more thorough than the scrutiny applied to Catherine Walsh. Investigators traveled to Boston to interview her associates, examined her financial records dating back over a decade, and consulted with charitable organizations throughout the East to verify her claims about her philanthropic activities. The investigation found no evidence of criminal connections or suspicious activities. Eleanor's purchase of the widows' inn was approved in September 1883, subject to the most extensive regulatory requirements ever imposed on a private hospitality establishment. She agreed to federal oversight, regular inspections, detailed record-keeping, and immediate reporting of any unusual incidents or suspicious activities. She also accepted requirements for federal approval of all staff appointments and operational changes. The renovation of the inn under Eleanor's direction was comprehensive and reflected her charitable mission. She created separate accommodations for women and families, installed enhanced security features, and established medical facilities staffed by qualified nurses. The common areas were designed to provide safe spaces where women could socialize and support each other during their travels. Eleanor's staffing approach prioritized safety and security for vulnerable travelers. She hired female staff whenever possible, including qualified nurses, teachers, and former governesses who could provide appropriate support and guidance for women and children. Her security staff included retired military personnel who had experience protecting civilian populations in hostile environments. The reopening of the Widows' Inn as a charitable institution in March 1884 was celebrated by women's organizations throughout the territories as a breakthrough in travel safety for vulnerable populations. Eleanor's establishment quickly became known as a haven for women traveling alone, families in distress, and children who required safe passage through dangerous frontier regions. For over a year, Eleanor's operation appeared to be a complete success. Federal inspections consistently found evidence of excellent management and genuine charitable service. Her guest accommodations were consistently full, and testimonials from satisfied guests praised the safety, comfort, and support they had received during their stays. However, the pattern that had characterized the inn's entire history was about to repeat itself one final time. In May 1885, Eleanor Blackwood disappeared mysteriously during what appeared to be a routine business trip to Denver. Her staff reported that she had departed normally to meet with suppliers and charitable organizations, but she never reached her destination and was never seen again. The investigation into Eleanor's disappearance revealed evidence that the criminal network that had supposedly been destroyed was actually still operating in modified form. Rather than maintaining permanent bases like the Widows' Inn, the criminals had adapted their methods to take advantage of legitimate establishments by eliminating their operators when necessary and installing their own people as replacements. Eleanor had apparently discovered evidence of criminal activity among her guests and had been preparing to report it to federal authorities when she was eliminated. Her disappearance was intended to clear the way for criminals to take control of her charitable institution and use it as a base for exploitation of the vulnerable women and children she had been protecting. The investigation also revealed that Eleanor's charitable work had been genuine, but that her success in creating a safe haven for vulnerable travelers had made her establishment attractive to criminals who specialized in exploiting such populations. Her security measures had been sophisticated enough to prevent criminal infiltration during normal operations, but they had not protected her from elimination when she became a threat to criminal interests. The federal response to Eleanor's disappearance was swift and decisive. Rather than allowing another operator to take control of the inn, authorities made the permanent decision to close the establishment and demolish the building. The demolition was completed in August 1885, finally ending the dark history of the Widows' Inn and preventing any future exploitation of its strategic location. The demolition of the Widows' Inn in 1885 was intended to be thorough and complete, erasing all traces of the building that had served as the center of so much criminal activity. However, the work crew tasked with the demolition made discoveries that revealed the full scope of the horrors that had been committed at the establishment over its 14 years of operation. Beneath the inn's foundation, workers discovered an extensive network of chambers and tunnels that had been used for body disposal and evidence destruction. The sophistication of these underground facilities suggested that they had been constructed as part of the original building plans, indicating that criminal activity had been intended from the moment the inn was established. The chambers contained the remains of at least 47 individuals, along with personal effects that allowed investigators to identify many of the victims. The forensic examination revealed that the victims had died from various causes, including poisoning, violence, and what appeared to be systematic starvation or exposure. The condition of the remains suggested that some victims had been kept alive for extended periods before being killed. More disturbing was the discovery of detailed records that documented the criminal activities that had taken place at the inn throughout its entire operational period. These records revealed that every operator of the establishment had been part of the same criminal network, and that the apparent succession of different widows had been carefully orchestrated to maintain criminal control while avoiding detection. The records showed that Margaret Henley, the inn's original operator, had been a professional criminal with extensive experience in similar operations throughout the frontier territories. Her daughters Sarah and Emma had been trained from childhood to participate in criminal activities, and their apparent psychological breakdowns had been the result of internal conflicts within the criminal organization rather than guilt over their crimes. Victoria Sterling was revealed to have been the network's regional coordinator, responsible for managing multiple criminal operations throughout Colorado Territory. Her sophisticated methods and political connections had been developed through years of experience in criminal enterprises that had operated successfully in other territories before moving to Colorado. Rebecca Morrison had been brought in to restore the Inn's operations after Victoria's death had disrupted the network's activities. Her apparent success in legitimizing the establishment had actually been part of a sophisticated deception designed to reduce official scrutiny while criminal activities continued in modified form. Catherine Walsh was revealed to have been a genuine victim rather than a criminal operator. Her legitimate management of the Inn had interfered with the network's plans to resume full criminal operations, leading to her murder and the intended installation of another criminal operator. Her death had been intended to clear the way for Eleanor Blackwood's elimination and replacement. Eleanor Blackwood's charitable work had been genuine, but her establishment had been infiltrated by criminals who had eliminated her when she discovered their activities. Her disappearance had been the final act in the criminal network's attempts to regain control of the strategic location represented by the Widow's Inn. The investigation revealed that the criminal network had been operating similar establishments throughout the frontier territories, using hospitality businesses as bases for systematic exploitation of travelers. The Widow's Inn had been one of the most successful operations, but it was part of a larger enterprise that had been responsible for hundreds of murders and disappearances over more than 2 decades. The federal prosecution that followed these discoveries resulted in the largest criminal conspiracy trial in the history of the territories. The evidence was so extensive and damning that most of the surviving network members accepted plea agreements rather than face trial, providing testimony that revealed the full scope of their criminal activities. The trial revealed that the network had operated as a sophisticated business enterprise, with formal organizational structures, training programs, and systematic approaches to victim selection and exploitation. The criminals had studied legitimate business practices and adapted them for criminal purposes, creating an organization that was more efficient and profitable than many legal enterprises of the era. The publicity surrounding the trial created national awareness of the dangers that had been hidden behind the facades of frontier hospitality establishments. The revelations led to significant reforms in territorial law enforcement and federal oversight of frontier businesses, establishing precedents that would influence criminal justice practices for decades. The site of the former Widow's Inn was declared a federal memorial to the victims of the criminal network, with a monument erected to commemorate those who had died at the establishment. However, local opposition to the memorial was so strong that it was eventually removed and the site left unmarked, allowing the location to return to wilderness. The story of the Widow's Inn ended with the demolition of the building in 1885, but its legacy continued to influence frontier justice and hospitality industry practices for decades afterward. The revelation that a single establishment had served as the center of systematic criminal activity for 14 years, resulting in the deaths of dozens of innocent travelers, created lasting changes in how such businesses were regulated and monitored. The federal oversight procedures developed in response to the Widow's Inn crimes became standard practice for hospitality establishments in isolated frontier locations. Regular inspections, detailed record-keeping requirements, and background investigations for operators were implemented throughout the territories, making it much more difficult for criminals to exploit such businesses for illegal purposes. The criminal prosecution techniques developed during the investigation and trial of the network members established important precedents for federal jurisdiction over interstate criminal enterprises. The legal theories and evidence-gathering methods pioneered in these cases influenced criminal justice practices throughout the United States, contributing to the development of modern federal law enforcement capabilities. The impact on the hospitality industry was profound and lasting. Travelers became much more cautious about choosing accommodations, particularly in isolated locations where criminal activity could occur without witnesses. Legitimate innkeepers found themselves subject to increased scrutiny and regulation, but also benefited from improved public confidence as the industry's reputation gradually recovered. The psychological impact on the frontier communities that had been affected by the criminal network was severe and persistent. The revelation that respected business establishments had been centers of systematic murder and exploitation created lasting trauma that affected social relationships and community trust for generations. The Devil's Canyon route itself never recovered from the notoriety associated with the Widow's Inn. Alternative routes were developed that avoided the area entirely, and the community that had existed around the inn gradually dispersed as economic opportunities disappeared. By 1890, the canyon had returned to wilderness, with only scattered ruins marking the locations of former businesses and residences. Dr. Whitmore's detailed medical records of the criminal activities became important resources for forensic investigators and medical researchers studying the effects of systematic poisoning and violence. His documentation contributed to advances in forensic medicine and toxicology that helped improve criminal investigations throughout the country. Jonas Pittman's observations about the disposal of victims' property led to new police procedures for investigating suspicious deaths and missing person cases. His experience demonstrated the importance of paying attention to seemingly minor details that might indicate larger patterns of criminal activity. The federal investigators who had worked on the case established new training programs and investigative techniques that were adopted by law enforcement agencies throughout the territories. Their methods became standard practice for investigating complex criminal conspiracies and interstate criminal enterprises. However, questions remained about the full scope of the criminal network and whether similar operations had existed in other locations. The sophistication and success of the Widow's Inn operation suggested that it was part of a larger pattern of criminal activity that might have extended beyond the territories that had been investigated. Modern historians and criminologists who have studied the case consider it one of the most significant examples of organized crime in 19th century America. The systematic nature of the criminal activities, the sophisticated methods employed, and the extensive network of accomplices and collaborators represent characteristics that would later be associated with modern organized crime syndicates. The physical evidence from the site continues to yield new information about the crimes that were committed there. Archaeological investigations conducted in the 1920s revealed additional remains and evidence that had not been discovered during the original demolition. These findings confirmed the scope of the criminal activities while raising new questions about the total number of victims. The construction crew that discovered the buried cooking pot in 1967 found evidence that supported historical accounts of the criminal activities while adding new details about the methods that had been employed. However, the discovery was considered too disturbing for public discussion, and most of the evidence was reburied rather than preserved for historical study. Local legends and folklore about the Widow's Inn have persisted in the region, with stories passed down through families that lived through the events. These oral traditions have preserved details about the crimes that were not included in official records, providing valuable insights into the community impact of the criminal activities. The site of the former inn remains largely undisturbed today, marked only by scattered foundation stones and the depression where the basement chambers were located. Occasional visitors to the area report unusual phenomena that they attribute to the violent history of the location, but these claims have not been scientifically investigated. The story of the Widow's Inn serves as a reminder of how evil can flourish behind facades of respectability and hospitality, particularly in isolated locations where normal social controls and law enforcement are absent. The systematic nature of the crimes and the length of time they continued undetected demonstrate the importance of vigilance and the need for effective oversight of businesses that serve vulnerable populations. The case also illustrates how criminal networks can adapt and evolve in response to law enforcement efforts, using legitimate businesses as cover while developing increasingly sophisticated methods for avoiding detection. The success of the Widow's Inn operation for 14 years demonstrates the challenges faced by frontier law enforcement in dealing with organized criminal activity. But perhaps most importantly, the story reminds us that the most dangerous predators are often those who appear most trustworthy and helpful. The widows who operated the inn were skilled at presenting themselves as respectable businesswomen who provided essential services to travelers in need, making it easy for potential victims to trust them completely. The truth about the Widow's Inn was hidden for so long because the criminals understood that the best disguise for evil is the appearance of good. They exploited people's natural desire to find safety and comfort during dangerous journeys, using hospitality and kindness as weapons to disarm their victims' natural caution. Today, the Devil's Canyon remains a beautiful but isolated wilderness area, with no visible signs of the thriving community that once existed there. The forest has reclaimed the sites where buildings once stood, and wildlife has returned to areas that were once bustling with human activity. Nature has healed the physical scars left by the criminal activities, but the historical memory of what happened there serves as a permanent reminder of the darkness that can lurk behind the most innocent appearances. As we conclude this dark chapter from America's frontier history, we're reminded that evil often wears the mask of kindness, and that the most dangerous places are sometimes those that promise the greatest safety. The widows of Devil's Canyon understood that trust is the most valuable currency in any relationship, and they spent it without conscience to feed their appetite for wealth and violence. What happened at the widows and could happen again, in different forms and different places, wherever isolation and desperation create opportunities for predators to exploit the vulnerable. The story serves as a warning that vigilance is the price of safety, and that we must never allow our desire for comfort and security to override our instinct for caution. If this story has given you chills, you're not alone. The horrors that took place at the widows and remind us that the past is full of darkness that we're still uncovering today. Share this video with someone who appreciates dark history, hit that like button to help us continue bringing these forgotten stories to light, and make sure to subscribe for more tales from America's hidden past. Let us know in the comments what you think really happened to Eleanor Blackwood, and whether you believe all the members of the criminal network were ever caught. Until next time, remember that history's greatest monsters often wore the faces of those we trusted most. Sleep well and travel safely.